a hand. So I think that's probably enough chit chat about the technical stuff. We have got so much to cover this evening. So I will say it's impossible to talk fully about Chardonnay in an hour. You probably could talk about Chardonnay for a year and still not cover the whole ethos or spectrum that this amazing grape variety can achieve. So it is going to be an overview, but hopefully you'll agree that we've picked a few wines that explore the things that Chardonnay can do. So there will be a presentation this evening. There's a few sort of bottle shots, but also some maps and images. So hopefully you'll be able to see all of that. I'm going to hopefully get up my shared screen now and we'll get cracking. So the many faces of Chardonnay. I thought I'd start with a little bit of information, particularly about the grape itself. It is a cross between Pinot Noir and Gouais Blanc. And don't worry if you've never heard of Gouais Blanc. It's nearly impossible to find 100% Gouais Blanc now. But that particular pairing, Pinot Noir and Gouais Blanc, has produced loads of different baby children vines, of which Chardonnay is easily the most famous. It's also a grape variety that has loads of clones. So there are lots of different mini species of Chardonnay. And we could talk for ages about different clones. So Dijon clones from Burgundy, or Mendoza clones, which is a bit of a misnomer because they're usually found in New Zealand and Australia. But effectively, this is a grape variety that already within its species has a huge amount of range. So I like to think of it as the Madonna of the grape world. You'll have to excuse my my basic way of explaining it, but it's the reinvention grape. It's the grape that has many faces. So not only does genetically Chardonnay have lots of different variants, so I've mentioned clones, there's over 30 in France alone, but also it can be manipulated to make so many different expressions. And if you were to say that Riesling is the mirror, they often call it the mirror grape because it reflects the terroir where it's grown. I like to think of Chardonnay as the blank easel. It's the blank canvas, rather, that the painter, the winemaker, can work with. So it's Madonna to me. It's got a million different versions of itself. It's got the sort of simple and the pure expressions right through to the over-the-top dramatic Madonna versions. So you have to excuse my very basic comparison there. But what can it produce? Well, I'm not going to go into it too much, just purely because I know that not everyone this evening bought sparkling wines, but I did suggest if you wanted to join me for an aperitif, I've got the Lilbert champagne, which I'll talk about in a second, but Chardonnay is an absolutely great variety for producing sparkling wine. So the two I've suggested this evening are the Simon Sig Cap Classique Blanc de Blanc, and then I'll just nip onto the next slide to show you the Champagne Lilbert Grand Cru Blanc de Blanc. Now, you'll notice in both of those, they were called Blanc de Blanc, meaning white from white. Now, not exclusively does that mean it's Chardonnay, but more often than not, it does mean that the three main champagne grape varieties essentially are Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, both red grapes, and then Chardonnay, which is a white grape. So if you see champagne that says Blanc de Blanc, chances are it's 100% Chardonnay. And actually, in most of the New World, that sort of applies as well. Although, like I said, it could be 100% Chenin, for example. But in the two cases tonight of the wines I suggested, they're both Chardonnay, 100%, and they are both, they've both had 3 years sat on the lees. I'm going to talk about lees aging later, but part of the beauty of creating sparkling wines using the Chardonnay grape variety is that Chardonnay is this blank canvas and it takes to those lees flavors really nicely. So if you have got a glass and you're joining me, then hopefully what you can smell is a sort of bready, yeasty aroma, and that's from the winemaking. That's not from the grape variety. In fact, they try and make sparkling wine from Chardonnay as neutral as possible. And then you can add these lovely autolytic characteristics. But the good thing about Blanc de Blanc that sets it apart from other sparkling wines is that Chardonnay naturally, if you pick it early, has this incredible acidity. So it means that you get this lovely, refreshing, sort of lean and linear sparkling wine when young, but that acidity also means that Blanc de Blanc sparkling wines age incredibly well. Arguably, they age even better than their Blanc de Noir or white from black counterparts. So if you are having a glass of that, I hope you are enjoying it. I will quickly zoom around where Chardonnay can be grown. And I was going to put a map up and say where Chardonnay could be grown, but it's actually a waste of time because Chardonnay is grown in every winemaking region in the world. It's produced in different styles, like I said, from sparkling to clean and crisp to big oaky, right through to sweet wines. So you can have ice wine in Canada made from Chardonnay. You can have sweet wines from the Jura made from Chardonnay. And whilst it's probably not the most prestigious grape variety to make sweet wines from, it can be done and it's delicious. So yes, it's grown everywhere to different versions of success. One of the reasons is that it can grow in a lot of climates. And so the first thing I want to address before we move on is the sort of 3 different types of climates that Chardonnay can grow in, and therefore what you might expect flavor-wise. So cool climate Chardonnay, so we're talking Champagne, places like Chablis, but also some New World places, so Santa Barbara in California is actually a very cool climate, or the Yarra Valley, where our blind spot is from in Australia, also cool climate. Those tend to produce Chardonnay that has lemon, lime, green apple flavors. Then we start to get a little bit warmer. So we're talking moderate climates. Let's think things like the Côte d'Or, so a bit further south in Burgundy. And I have a tiny little map for you there. The Côte d'Or produces, it's this combination here of the Côte de Nuit and the Côte de Beaune. And it's further south from Chablis, you can see here, and that tends to produce more, they call them stone fruits, orchard fruits is sometimes used as well, but things like peaches, nectarines, white Asian pear, if anyone's ever had white Asian pear, is a very popular term to use for these sort of moderate climate Chardonnays. And then you move to the hotter climates. Now, in hot years, the Mâconnais can actually produce wines of this style. So that's in the south of Burgundy, but also warmer places. So further inland, I'm thinking places like Lodi in California, the more inland areas of Australia, for example, they produce tropical fruits. So pineapple, melon, all of those kind of richer, sweeter fruits. And that is just Chardonnay, the grape variety. It has this massive, massive spectrum. So you can't say that Chardonnay tastes like lemons, and you can't say that Chardonnay tastes like pineapple, because actually this spectrum that it produces is so huge. And the first thing is the climate. That's the first thing that makes this massive difference. Now, the heartland of Chardonnay is Burgundy. So the map I'm showing you now, that's where the grape originated. But it's interesting to say that it wasn't well known, shall we say. We think of Chardonnay now as being this international superstar, similar to Madonna, but it wasn't actually a global success until really the 70s, 60s and 70s. And until then, it was really just mainly produced in Burgundy, but it was producing some of the finest white wines in the world. So we are going to start in Chablis, in this yellow area here. And I know that some members will say, well, why haven't we done all of Burgundy? Because there are some unbelievably amazing wines. The finest wines in the world are produced in the Côte d'Or, in this section here that you can see. The reality is we just don't have the time. And I wanted to show Chardonnay from multiple countries. So as much as I would have liked to, we just don't have hours and hours and hours. But don't worry, I will explore Chardonnay, and Toby Morale, our buyer for Burgundy, has already done a brilliant session on the Mâconnais down here in the south that I will send you a link to after this. So we'll just be doing Chablis for today, but with good reason. So if anyone does have wine number one, that is our Society's Chablis 2020. Now, the Chablis 2020, I'll grab my glass, is produced for us by J.M. Brocard. It's actually his son now that produces it for us. As I mentioned, this is cool climate. So if anyone does have it in the glass, have a little smell. Hopefully you are getting those sort of lemons, green apple flavors. We shouldn't be getting at this point really tropical flavors. Although I will say 2020 was a very hot year. So it's a little warmer than some other vintages. So you might get a bit of peach and those sorts of flavors in there. Now, Chablis is considered by most to be I think I might have a better map. Here we go. Chablis is considered by most to be the purest expression in the world of Chardonnay. Chardonnay loves any soil type, but it particularly loves, or thrives, I should say, on limestone. And in Chablis, there is this beautiful, gorgeous limestone crop. And so it really, really thrives here. You'll see that the sort of orange and red sections are the higher end of the quality spectrum, and they run along the river. The red in particular are the Grand Cru. Now, Grand Cru can be aged in oak, so you might, if you scale up and buy a more expensive Grand Cru Chablis, you might find that it is richer and that it does have more body and fullness. But most Chablis from the orange sections, from the green sections, yellow sections, those will be the sort of unadulterated versions of Chardonnay. So this particular wine comes from these three villages. So I've not done it particularly well, but Fille is where the majority comes from. Oh, sorry, I tell a lie. Prairie, which is the bottom one on your screen. Fille and La Chapelle Vaupoteline, and you'll have to excuse my French pronunciation. So Toby blends this wine. I'll buy it for Burgundy. And when I was asking him why, he said that Prairie is his particular, he thinks for a village Chablis that this is an absolute top quality village and really underrated. So over half of the blend comes from that village. It is fermented in tank. So we're going to go on to winemaking later because it's so important when we're talking about Chardonnay. But this has had no oak influence. So it was made in an inner vessel, no oak chips. Nothing we've got tonight has oak chips, but no oak barrels. It's been in stainless steel. And then all it's had done is it's sat on those dead yeast cells, the lees, for 8 to 9 months. So we're going to talk about what that adds later. But if you can smell something, you probably can't smell it, but you might be able to taste it. Do have a taste. I've got my spittoon, but it should be quite linear, really refreshing because we're up in the north. We've got bright acidity. So it should be lovely, fresh, and like I say, unadulterated Chardonnay. So do have a try. I'd be keen to know what you think. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat to see if anyone's got it. And yes, essentially, mostly unoaked. And like I mentioned, if you are going to the upper cruise, you might find a little bit of oak influence, but generally not. So I love this wine. I think it's a really, really simple but well-made wine, nice and easy to drink. Goes amazingly with seafood, those sorts of things. Oysters is always a really nice one for Chablis. So definitely, if you get a chance, Chablis and oysters is a top choice of mine. And then, yes, so we've got a few people saying loving this wine. That's great. Do have a taste. I'm going to have a quick taste now. Yeah, for me, it's lemon, it's lime, it's fresh. It's exactly what you want of a Chablis. The other thing that really sets Chablis apart that I'm getting in spades with this wine is that minerality. It's got a slight chalkiness, a slight flintiness. It's not dissimilar to the chalky flintiness you might find in something like a Sancerre, but Chardonnay is not an aromatic grape variety. So Sancerre is from the Loire, made with Sauvignon Blanc. And if you smell a Sauvignon Blanc, you get hit by all of these amazing aromas. Chardonnay isn't that. It's not got these wild aromas. It's more to do with texture and feeling in the mouth. And that's really where the joy of Chardonnay comes from, as well as all of these fun winemaking techniques that we're going to talk about shortly. So I hope that you've liked that wine. I wish I could talk more about Chablis. It's a real personal favourite of mine. I would say that if you can, it's worth going to the sort of £15 mark in Chablis, because the value of 15 to sort of £18 in Chablis trumps, in my opinion, way beyond what the Côte d'Or can do. The price of oaked sort of Côte d'Or, or sometimes even Mâconnais and Prix-Fusé Chardonnay from further down south in Burgundy is expensive. There's been a huge escalation in those prices, particularly the older, the keeping wines. But Chablis punches really well. It can age because it's got that lovely acidity. And yes, like I said, if you just treat yourself to a nice bottle of Chablis, you will be really, really pleased. I hope. I certainly find I'm always constantly surprised by the value for money that you can get with your Chablis. So unfortunately, I do have to move on, but I'll just check if we've got any questions. Hello, Catherine. Catherine's going to be my question master this evening. So thank you, Catherine.
Hello. Lovely. So we do have a question that is pertinent to the Chablis, and it's just whether it has gone through any malolactic. And perhaps you could just give us a little overview on the malolactic.
Lovely. Well, I'm going to go into a little bit more depth on malolactic shortly, and what that is. It actually is quite an interesting... Actually, let's do it now. If the members ask, let's do it now. So malolactic fermentation or conversion is effectively, once you've got your juice, you have a type of acid that naturally occurs in your juice called malic acid. And that effectively is an acid that you would get if you bite into a green apple. Really mouth-watering, but very, very zingy. Now, that kind of acid is very attractive for something like Chablis. So you'd want to keep some of that acid. For warmer climates, sometimes they want to convert that acid into a lactic acid. So a lactic acid is what you get when you drink milk, or my favorite way of describing lactic acid is next time you have a piece of brie cheese, it's actually very acidic. It's very, very tart. And that lactic acid you can convert that malic acid into lactic acid by adding a bacteria into your wine. Now, a few things that it does is, firstly, it makes the wine more stable. So if you don't want that to happen, you do have to add sulfur to the wine, and that stops this conversion happening. It's interesting to say that the Burgundy producers further south use a lot more malolactic fermentation because they want that rounder, kind of softer acid, whereas Chablis is perfectly suited. So this wine has not got, to my knowledge, any malolactic fermentation. Whereas in the south of Burgundy, where it's a little bit warmer, you would want to convert those acids. One of the interesting things that pertains to the next wine is when the Chardonnay boom happened in the 80s, lots of New World producers were looking to emulate that middle Côte d'Or, very expensive style of Chardonnay. And so they were putting their wines through malolactic conversion, usually all of the wines. So you can do half and half, you could do 30%, 70%, but they were putting all of their wines through malolactic conversion. And what that meant is that for the Côte d'Or, it's nice because you get richness, but you still have a freshness because it's not too hot. But one of the problems, particularly with Australian wines, which is why it's relevant to the next one, hot Australian wines were putting tropical fruits, really pineapple-y, mango, banana in some cases, through malolactic conversion. And then what you end up with is like banana and yogurt. And whilst that can be appealing, it can be quite cloying. Whereas in Burgundy, in the middle of Burgundy, what they were getting was more like peaches and yogurt, which was far more attractive. So by the New World kind of copying that malolactic style, a lot of people think that's what pushed Chardonnay too far and made these kind of very cloying, very rich, but maybe not very palatable wines that were more like being whacked over the head rather than the subtleness. So that was the long answer to the question, but the short answer is you tend not to use malolactic in Chablis. You want to keep the acids fresh. You would not use malolactic if you wanted that linear style, but you would use it if you wanted to round out the wines and get a bit more mouthfeel. So yes, if you are tasting, I always smell yogurt. That's the thing I smell when I get malolactic. It can sometimes smell a little bit yogurty. It's really attractive. And I've just spotted my Meursault has definitely gone through malolactic. Yeah, Meursaults, wines from the Mâconnais often do. And it's not a bad thing. It's a lovely thing. But it just depends. It depends on the style of the wine that you're wanting. So yes. Any more questions, Catherine?
We do have one more, just at the moment. It's from Beth. She's asking, can you realistically get a fuller or richer Chardonnay with oak from Chablis at the £15 to £18 price point? She's heard that top-end Chablis can be more this way inclined.
Yeah, absolutely. So you kind of need to follow different producers. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. Gil or Catherine might be able to pop some in the chat if we've got any, but generally, it tends to be the Cru wines that go through oak, and that just, sorry, you did ask oak, didn't you? Or did you ask oak? That they tend to be the ones that have gone through oak. But I should mention, we're going to talk about oak right towards the end because we've got a big oaky wine. Oak is not a one size fits all. So there are so many variables on oak. And one thing that Chablis will do instead of perhaps the final wine is Chablis producers would use old oak and larger barrels. And then what you're doing is you're getting texture to your Chardonnay, but you're not getting the flavor. And we will talk about that later in depth. So don't worry. But yes, the answer is absolutely £15 plus. If you found the right producer who's using old oak barrels, Foudres or those sorts of things, you can get some really lovely that's got this sort of broader texture. It's not so, I don't want to use the word thin because it sounds negative, but lean is the word we use in the wine industry. It's not as lean, it will be broader. There we go. So this particular wine we've popped in the chat sees partial fermentation in oak Foudres. So you absolutely can get it. And they're wonderful wines as well. They're just that little bit richer. You might want to be going for more of a sort of fish in a sauce rather than a fresh oyster with those wines. So I'm conscious of time. I'm going to talk about Mac Forbes Blind Spot Chardonnay now, because I am going to dispel the myth that we were just talking about, which is the 1980s hangover that all Australian wine is tutti frutti and oaked. I've obviously just mentioned that they were sort of emulating the Côte d'Or by using malolactic, but they were also emulating the Côte d'Or by using more oak. And they were, if you imagine the Chardonnay boom happened, they were probably buying a lot of new oak and imparting lots of flavour. And yeah, you get this kind of tutti frutti, intense mega mix. They also weren't necessarily using old oak barrels. So we'll talk about the nasties of oak, because there are nasties if it's not done well. But I wanted to prove that it is not all like that. And Mac Forbes does this beautifully. So I'm going to grab my slides back up. This is the Chardonnay vines for you. Lovely limestone soil. Apologies, I forgot to get that picture up. Gorgeous dotted limestone through the vines. You can see there that Chardonnay just absolutely loves. Great drainage. So let's talk Blind Spot Yarra Valley Chardonnay. Now, Mac makes this for us exclusively. Blind Spot is made especially for us. You'll see on the description, it's flint, citrus notes, crisp, fresh, delicate stripped back wine for appreciators of the less is more approach. So without putting words in his mouth, they've said more one for Chablis lovers on there. I was about to say without putting words. I've taken Freddie's words, our buyer for Australia, but this is made more in a Chablis style. So this one's got no malolactic fermentation, as we've just, it was in old oak, like I've just said, so there's no flavor. So there'll be a little bit of texture from the oak, but no flavor, and stainless steel. So he's made 2 different wines and then blended them together. The other thing about this is that the Yarra Valley, and I'll just show you on the map. So here's the map of Australia, obviously. Then we've got this lovely circle down here, encompassing Adelaide down to Melbourne. Now, Melbourne has a beautiful set of gorgeous cool climate wine regions around it. In particular, this is a zoomed in section, Mornington Peninsula, Geelong and Yarra Valley. These 3 in particular make fantastic cool climate wines. And the main reason is the sea is just coming in and those winds are cooling them down. And you actually, you know, you'd think Australian wine, it's hot, it's jammy, it's sunshine, it's the beach, but these wines are actually grown in a cold place. So I hope some of you came with preconceptions about Australian wine if you bought it. But for me, on the nose, it's limey. It's less lemon and it's more limey. There's a bit of grapefruit. There is still that bit of flint, which I love. Whilst you're having a sniff, if you've got it, I'll show you this beautiful part of the world. You can see these cool fogs coming in, cooling down the grapes. They basically act like an air conditioner. So the Yarra Valley is perfect for this really bright, acidic, fresh style of Chardonnay that is, quite frankly, a whole different ballgame. And if you want to go again, a sort of notch up and go more premium, there are some incredible producers. I'm a particular fan of Mornington Peninsula. I'm not sure which we've got on sale at the moment, actually, of Mornington Peninsula wines, but the producers from there, really small farmers who literally work mainly with Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And one rule that is not to live by, but you could certainly consider, is if you're buying a Chardonnay from a region that grows Pinot Noir, which loves the cooler climates, chances are you're in a cool climate region. So you can almost check what your Chardonnay might be like by seeing what other red grapes are grown around it. So, for example, in the southern parts, or let's say Los Carneros in California, it's very cold. They make sparkling wine. They grow a lot of Pinot Noir. You're going to get a cool style of Chardonnay. If you then go up and you go into the warmer parts of, say, northern Napa, you're going to find Cabernet Sauvignon is grown. Now, Cabernet Sauvignon likes a little bit more warmth, so you're not going to find as cooler climate Chardonnay. So it's an interesting way of sort of trying to work out how cool is the area that this is grown. So Yarra Valley, definitely part of the world that grows Pinot Noir. So where you find Pinot, you find cool climate Chardonnay. So I think, yeah, and I agree. I've just seen Jeff's comment. I do think there's some stone fruit here. I think so Max said that these fruit parcels actually do come from slightly warmer sites in the Yarra Valley. It's still cool, but it's certainly not kind of racing and too searing. But I love the smell of that. It's really restrained. It's really lovely. It's sort of friendly and summery. And again, I think it's the kind of wine that you drink in the garden, and you'd enjoy some salads, lunch. Yeah, definitely a lunch wine. Dinner as well, but also a lunch wine. Catherine, have we got any questions about the Yarra Valley or Mac or?
We don't have any questions that have come through for that, but just to let members know, as you were saying about wines from the Mornington Peninsula, we currently have the Ocean 8 Verve Chardonnay. So I'll pop the link for that in the chat.
That's one of my personal favourites. So that is a really good one if you do want to go into that kind of premium winemaking of cool climate Chardonnay in that part of the world, for sure. Just whilst we're on the topic of where it's grown, because now we're talking about climates, I've obviously said it's grown everywhere, but some of the best expressions, if you're looking for other countries, are Argentina actually makes fantastic Chardonnay. It's slightly on the warmer side. Chile particular the Limeray Valley they're fantastic. They've got the limestone soils and the cool climates, so they're particularly special. But you can also find it in Germany, Austria. You can find it, I've obviously mentioned the US, and not mentioned yet New Zealand, our next wine, but you really can find it in every wine growing region. So it's worth exploring, but like I said, if you're not sure what style you're getting, often the wine label will use the fruit descriptors, so citrus, stone fruits, or tropical fruits, and that's a pretty good indication. But the other thing is, if you research that area, that particular part of the world, see what other grapes are grown there, it can be a really good indicator on style. And South Africa, you're right, Keith. Sorry, my favourite country. How did I miss it? Is there another question, Catherine?
There is one that's just current to what we're saying about climate. This is from John Kavanagh, and he's saying that presumably climate change will have, or is having, a huge impact on the style of Chardonnay from different regions. Will the hot Chardonnay areas become too hot for it, or will its style just evolve into something else?
It's a great question. The hot Chardonnay parts of the world, and some parts really are already too hot, and I'm thinking kind of Central Australia, where they grow Chardonnay for mass production. They acidify, so they will add acid, usually tartaric acid afterwards. Now, a connoisseuring wine drinker, I'm not sure that's a word, might be able to actually tell that that's not a natural acid. Sometimes it can feel really out of balance. And I think for that reason, there is a move away from Chardonnay in those regions, not exclusively, but they also blend it as well. So they might blend it with something that's a bit more heat resistant. Interestingly, it is allowed, for example, in Cava in the Penedès. Chardonnay is a grape allowed there. And increasingly producers in Cava are not using it so much, and instead favouring regional white grapes that actually retain the acid a bit better. Because what happens when Chardonnay ripens is you can almost continue to get incredible flavors as it ripens, but the moment it's ready to pick, the acid drops off. So if you miss that point, you basically end up with really flabby wines. So a lot of producers in warmer places will be rethinking whether Chardonnay is right because that acid isn't right. And the sort of commercial producers that are growing Chardonnay because it's popular will probably be acidifying. But I think if you're a quality producer, you're not going to want to acidify. You want to make sure that you're producing a wine that is how it's supposed to be, i.e. not adding too much. So you wouldn't. The flip side to the global warming question is that countries that historically couldn't produce good quality Chardonnay, and the one that springs to mind so obviously is England. England was producing Chardonnay for sparkling wine because we couldn't quite get to this full ripeness. And if you don't reach full ripeness with Chardonnay, it's really uninteresting. It's quite green, but great for sparkling wine because we don't need anything other than a base to add all those beautiful yeasty layers we were talking about. But basically, places like England that have got those 1 or 2 degrees warmer can actually now produce really good quality still Chardonnay. And that's something that's just come about in the last 10 years. So there's flip sides. I think as climate change and global warming influences the temperature of these places, naturally some areas will have to either reconsider or really manipulate their wines, or completely change the way they grow their wines, which is a whole other question. Or they will have to, but the flip side is that other countries that historically couldn't grow good quality Chardonnay can now. So it's not that Chardonnay will we'll lose Chardonnay. It's just, I think, realistically, the vineyard places where it's planted will change. But it is a grape that tends to do well. Very few grapes can be grown in cool all the way through to warm climates. So it's lucky in that sense. There are quite a few that wouldn't be able to grow in the places that it's grown. So yes, but great question. Okay, so I'm going to get onto a bit of a meaty bit now, actually, which is some winemaking bits, because as I mentioned at the beginning, Chardonnay is the blank canvas. And what that means is they call it the winemaker's grape, because it means a winemaker can really put their stamp on it if they want to. Now, this is a lovely 2 slides from the wines of Australia. We'll send around the presentation afterwards if anyone's interested. I'm going to whip through these, but I'm going to tell you hopefully what you can taste, or why you would use some of these techniques, and hopefully a really brief, tiny bit about what it is. Obviously, this is not a winemaking masterclass. It's all about tasting Chardonnay. But if you are ready to taste, we're going to taste the Mahi, because this has had some winemaking, quite significant winemaking, and you can taste it, which is really interesting. So whole bunch pressing, it's a little bit confusing, but as it shows, you keep the stems and the leaves in rather than the berries off. So you have to pick them by hand, and then you put them in the press. And generally this tends to make a lighter wine. If you imagine putting loads of berries into one barrel, they would crush quite easily. What the stems do is they almost add a sort of structure within the barrel, or within your fermenter, or within your press rather. And it means that there's not so much pushing going on, and therefore the juice and the skins aren't already mixing together earlier. So whole bunch pressing is becoming quite trendy, and it does tend to make a more delicate style of wine. Cold fermentation, the next one along, and these are in a bit of a funny order, so I apologize. But cold fermentation, that's basically when you're creating the wine, the alcohol. Cold fermentation makes generally a lighter style, and if you increase the temperatures, then you get this kind of richer, and it's more akin to those tropical fruits as well. Barrel fermentation, so if you're producing the alcohol and making the chemical process in a barrel, or having the chemical process in a barrel, it imparts some roundness because you're getting oxygen through the staves. So it's kind of, it's called micro-oxygenation, and it makes the wine feel richer and broader. Malolactic fermentation we already covered, so that's good. Oak influence we're going to do properly when we get to the final wine, so I'll leave that one as well. And then we've just got one other slide. I'm conscious of rushing through, and I want to get on to the next wine, so you'll have to excuse me. But we have barrel maturation. We'll talk a bit more about what that means when we get to the oak, but essentially as well, the longer you leave it, the more it imparts. So that maturation process, i.e. leaving it in there. Now, here's where we get onto something interesting, and this is why I really wanted to talk about these techniques when we had this wine. Extended lees contact. Now, there are 2 types of lees. There's all of the mushy bits, the skins, the pips, the stalks, if you left them in earlier, and they're called the gross lees. And what you can do when you're producing Chardonnay is you can get rid of those immediately. So you rack off the wine and you leave all the gunk. And historically, it was very popular to get rid of those and not use the gunk. But Michael Brakovich, who's a very famous MW who works at Cumie River, believes that if you leave that gunk in for a little bit, you can actually create some complexity in wine. And it's becoming quite fashionable. There is a school of thought, and it's a good one, that leaving that gunk in also creates a reductive quality. Now, this wine to me is slightly reductive. It's a really good word if you don't know what it means yet, for when you smell it and when you've got it, it's a real wine snobby word that you can throw out to friends. But for me, different people have completely different levels of what reduction smells like to them, and also how much they can handle. So our buyer for South Africa and the Loire, Joe Locke MW, is not a particular fan of this style. Sarah Knowles MW, on the other hand, loves it. It can smell anything from flinty right through to struck matches. I get quite a bit of struck match on this. Now, if you really dislike it, you might actually initially smell something that's not akin to rotten egg, because that makes it sound horrible, but it's got a kind of funk to it. And there's no doubt that if you left all of that gross lees, the big stuff, by gross, I mean GROSS, not gross as in disgusting, gross as in big. If you leave that lees on, you can get some funky things, but it adds loads of complexity to the wine. which I love. And there's been, I think, a little bit of gross lees here. There's also another kind of lees that's far more common. So once you got rid of the gunk and you leave your wine to either settle in your barrel or your tank, there are dead yeast cells and tiny particles, and they're still floating in the wine. You can't see them, you can't remove them just by sort of moving the wine, but they are still present. And those lees, so they are the fine lees, they create a more autolytic character. And that is the character that we have right at the beginning in the sparkling wine, if you had that. So that's things like yeast and bread. And so those fine lees are very common. And you'll have fine lees in lots of your really very famous Côte d'Or wines, or many of your premium Chardonnays, to be honest. They add this lovely richness and complexity. So I think this has had both gross lees and fine lees, because I can smell a bit of both. Batonnage is basically putting a stick in your barrel and turning those lees around to make sure that you get as much flavour as possible. Fancy French word for stirring. Wild fermentation, that is when you have different yeasts can impart different flavours in the wine. And again, if we really wanted to geek out, we could talk for an hour about yeast. But effectively, wild fermentation means allowing the natural yeasts to create the fermentation, to produce the alcohol. You can buy yeast, and most people do. So Sauvignon Blanc has become really famous for those classic kind of grapefruit and those sorts of aromas. And one of the reasons is they very often control the yeast they add. And different yeasts will produce different things. They'll be more friendly with acids, or they'll be more likely to make peachy aromas. But if you use wild fermentation, you might not know what you're going to get. So it's a bit pot luck. But a lot of people believe that by using wild fermentation, you add more complexity, because chances are there's more than one type of yeast sat on the skins of your berries and in the winery. And it's not natural winemaking la-di-da. It's actually a really amazing way to make wine. We won't go into sparkling fermentation, secondary fermentation, because it's a bit much. Instead, we'll go on to the Mahi, which I love. So this is from New Zealand, and I'm hoping that some of you have it, because if you haven't tried it before, it's a very interesting wine. Freddie's noted that there's some straw. So for me, that straw could come from the lees, that kind of natural, not vegetal, but that kind of earthy thing. Preserved oranges and lemons, I think, is absolutely true. This did sit on the lees, and they haven't said which kind of lees, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's a combination, for 11 months. So this has had a lot of time to get that complexity. It also has gone, a pour of it has gone through malolactic fermentation. So we've got appley acids and yogurty acids. So we've got double types of acid in this. So we're really adding, I like to think of Chardonnay as you can add building blocks on top of it. Here we've added a lot of building blocks. So I'm going to let you taste it. This is a picture of the vineyards of Marlborough, where this wine's from in the north. I'm going to let you taste it, see if we've got any questions. Julia Shaw says struck match aromas are done really well, really interesting when done well, and I couldn't agree more, because Kumu River does them fantastically. New Zealand is a country that is particularly heroing or championing this style of wine. Personal favourite style of Chardonnay for me. Other places that do it are the Santa Maria Hills. There's quite a few producers in California trialing this style. But it's not for everyone. Yeah, somebody's called it stinky. I agree. It is stinky. Catherine, any questions?
Yeah, well, seeing you swirling your glass there, it seems that this question is the right sort of time to ask it. It's from Eleanor Decanter. She's asking, would you serve all styles of Chardonnay, so cool, warm, hot climate, in the same style of glass, one with a wider bowl?
Interesting question. I am a stickler for the same glassware all the time, just purely for ease, for convenience. But yes is the answer. And I would serve them in a wide bottom bowl like this glass here. They're from Vivo. The one thing I would say, Eleanor, and this is, this is sort of open to interpretation, but for a Chablis and for the first two wines, I would serve first three, if you count the sparkling, where there hasn't been too much winemaker influence, I would serve those fresh out the fridge, because they're fruity, they're fresh, and the acidity and the sort of refreshingness is what makes them appealing. These final two wines, the Mahi and the Bogle, I would bring 20-minute, which is why I've put them later in the tasting. I serve those slightly warmer. The reason I say that is they tend to open up a little bit when they've had some more time in the glass. They tend to be a bit more expressive, particularly with reductive styles of winemaking, where they've done everything they can to not let oxygen get in. You might find that the Mahi changes quite a lot in your glass as you drink it. It will initially have this struck match aroma, and then slowly, sometimes that will actually dissipate as the wine comes into contact with oxygen. So in theory, if you had an even wider glass and you served the Mahi in an even wider glass, it's touching more oxygen. So you could argue that reaction would happen faster. I personally wouldn't want that to happen faster because I love that struck match thing, but it's obviously a personal preference. So any more questions on that one, Catherine?
No, we've got no questions so far, but members, do pop them into the Q&A if you would like to ask any questions on the wines that Anna's talking about this evening.
Lovely. And I've seen Paul Lewis say that this is a bargain, in my opinion. I agree. There's a lot of winemaking that's gone into this wine, a huge amount of winemaking. So for the price, I think I would agree. A lot of thought and love. It's made by Brian Bicknell, who's a wonderful winemaker down at Mahi. So I'm conscious of time. I feel like I've rabbited on, but I could talk about Chardonnay for days. We've got to our fourth wine, and this is the wine I really wanted to use to talk about oak influence, because I should mention that the last wine we had was in old oak barrels. So again, they're getting texture but not flavor. This is the only wine really in the whole tasting where you can taste oak. Now, if you're not sure whether you like the taste of oak or not, we'll go through what happens. But the main thing is, if you're reading a wine note, the thing to look out for if you're not sure, if you don't want oak flavors, is the word new. You'll notice here Sarah has written 50% aged in new American oak. The key to that is that new oak has flavor and old oak, as actually the Mahi had, doesn't have flavor. So if you imagine it, it's a little bit like reusing a tea bag over and over again. Eventually it runs out. So this particular wine has had brand new oak in it. Now, I have politely stolen this from Kendall Jackson. And I'll send this around. We do work with Kendall Jackson, but I think it's a really good diagram to show you what happens with oak. So let's start with oak influence. So you've got barrels, they will add flavor and complexity. And then obviously the time. So the longer the Chardonnay is in an oak, the greater the time. We touched on that earlier. Literally as simple as that. If you leave it in longer, it will get more oak influence. There are naughty things that can happen. And this is where if you see a wine that says new oak and it's sort of £5 or £6, something's gone awry, because chances are that won't be a barrel. Barrels are around €800 for a new barrel. You can't sell wines at that price when you're buying brand new barrels for every batch. When I visited California, only one winery we went in, but I did see it, was using oak powder, which is effectively like an additive. It's really for commercial, large scale, low price wines. But there is a middle ground, and that is using oak chips, so pieces of oak, but they're not in the barrel themselves, or oak staves, so really big pieces of oak. And they literally drop them into the wine. Those will only impart flavor, and they won't do anything to add to the richness or the mouthfeel, because part of what an oak barrel does is that micro-oxygenation. So it allows a little bit of oxygen in, which actually future-proofs the wines to age. So often wines that have been aged in an oak barrel will last longer. They're almost, I don't like to use the term, but vaccinated a little bit against oxygen. Now, again, we've already talked about it, new oak versus neutral oak. So new oak's going to give you flavour. Neutral oak, after 3 to 5 uses, depending on the oak, 3 to 5 uses, there won't be flavour. You'll just get the texture. French versus new, and this again comes down to your preference. So this is new American oak. So if you have it in your glass, you should get vanilla and coconut. I personally really lovely old Riocas, like old style Riocas for me are vanilla and coconut, and they use American oak, interestingly, rather than European oaks. But for me, vanilla and coconut, definitely. French oak, which is a slightly different flavour. You might get vanilla, I really rarely do. You're more likely to actually get a woody flavour, like a woody smell. And I love that fireplace smoke. That's what I get. It's not sort of, it's almost like the embers of the fire, you know, when you've had a fire and then you come in the next morning and there's that kind of lovely musty but not intense smoky flavour. So I get that more from French oak. And then there's the size and the toastiness of the barrel. So toast level, I love this diagram with literal toast. It's no harder than that. When they make the barrels, they have to put them into fire and bend them, and you can choose how toasted you want them. So if you want really smoky flavors, you might go for a different grade, and if you want less, then you can choose that. And coopers, you know, the cooperage industry is huge and very, very technical, and this toast level is really important. And then barrel size. I should have had a better prop, but effectively, if you've got a small, if you imagine this is my barrel and I've put my wine into it, all of that wine has a lot of contact. If I went downstairs and I got a kitchen bin, and I put wine into it, a lot less would be touching the sides. So it means that you won't get as much of the oxygen permeating into the wine. So the bigger the oak, the less influence. The smaller the oak, the more influence. Literally, the wine is just, more wine is touching the oak, and it's as simple as that. So yes, I love this wine. It's, like I said, it had 8 months in new American oak, so you are getting a decent amount of that vanilla bean, but you also do get those fruits, and it's warmer here. The AVAs that this comes from are not the coastal cool climate ones. They are warmer, so you should be getting a bit more of the nectarine going into tropical. I do get a bit of mango on the nose, that kind of smell. This has also had, and this is why it's a mad price for this wine, it's also had batonnage, so the hand stirring of the lees. So the other thing that you get here is that lovely kind of, I don't know, almost honeycomby smell that comes from that. So apples and toast, and it's really, there's a lot going on with this wine, but it's still got a lovely freshness and a lovely acidity. Very, very different if you think all the way back to wine number 1. But yes, it's a very, very different wine. Catherine, have we got any questions on this one?
We do. We've had a question from Eliza asking, what would you eat with it?
Oh, okay. So I love this style of wine with something like a fish pie, or anything kind of creamy, because there's the malolactic fermentation has made it nice and creamy. I don't think this has gone through full malolactic. I'm not sure actually on the stats on this. I think they've left some, because there is that still, I get a little bit of the green apple acid right at the end. But for me, anything in a creamy sauce, that richness will work. I often find these wines going really well with nutmeg. So I think that's why I've always moved towards fish pie, because I put a bit of nutmeg on the top of my fish pie. And I find those sort of winter warming spices, autumnal spices, really friendly with this style of wine. So it is, it's definitely richer, and you need to make sure that the food matches that richness. creamy sauces, pasta, and a carbonara would be heaven.
Absolutely. We do have a poll ready for the
Oh, okay.
that we can launch if members have been trying them as you've been speaking. We can launch that now, Gil.
So if anyone has all 4 of them, please let me know. Steve's mentioned about Au Bon Climat. Now, Au Bon Climat is, I would say, probably my single favorite large format producer of Californian wines. I mean, like large scale. But they they're in Santa Barbara, so they're much more on the cooler side. So they are more akin, and they're not anything like it, but more akin to the Yarra Valley or the Mahi, where they will be doing less MLF. They'll be using older barrels, not new oak barrels. The acidity will be much higher. It's got the cooling influence. So it's amazing when people say Chardonnay from California, there's always a preconception that it's this. And this is a good example. There are some, sort of lower end, cloying, flabby, fat Chardonnays from California. Of course there are, but there are also really good affordable examples like this, right through to that cool climate Au Bon Climat style, which is much more, and even beyond that, Sandy, who we sometimes work with, Sandhi, they're producing incredibly cool climate Chardonnay that is, it's emulating the Chablis style, but it's not. It's still got the reduction of the Mahi, but very, very different in style. So I would always be careful. You can't use one big brush for Californian Chardonnay because it is an enormous place, and there are an enormous, annoyingly, I did read today how many, I think there's 1,000 different Chardonnays produced in California, like over 1,000 different styles of Chardonnay. So, maybe I'll make it my personal mission to try them all. But yeah, please do vote. I'm not allowed to vote, sadly, doesn't let me. But yeah, please vote. I'd love to see the answers, Catherine.
I think we may just be about ready to share them.
Oh, yes, TJ said, can't wait for you to work with Sandy again. Amazing quality and unbelievable price point. Now, the Bogle is the winner. There we go. Only just, I'd say. The Chablis, I'm really glad that everything got a vote. That's always my hope and my goal. But yeah, I think for me, the Chablis, the Bogle offers the most for the money because there is so much going on there. But I think there's a place for all of these different Chardonnays. It's why when anybody says to me, which is the one grape variety that you would drink if you could only choose one, I say Chardonnay, because I can have my Blanc de Blanc champagne or my Blanc de Blanc Cap Classique from South Africa. I can have my lunchtime Chablis, and then I can sit by the fire and enjoy a glass of smoky, toasty, delicious Bogle whilst I'm watching a film. So it does everything. There's no grape variety like it.
We've got one last question to finish up on, and I think this is a chance for you to stretch your Chardonnay love even further, Anna.
Okay.
So from Jeff Roberts, he's asking if we were to spend £10 more per bottle on these styles of Chardonnay, what sort of differences in quality would you expect? And do you have any specific recommendations?
Okay, so I'll do the recommendations second. You would see more. The reality is the main things that happen are probably the site will be better. So Chablis being the prime example, if you spend £10 more, you're going to be moving towards the cru sites, realistically, you're probably moving towards the crus. Likewise, if you might be moving to more of a single vineyard or a winemaker that's got a passion project and is focusing on something. So yes, you would see a difference, and I think it's worth exploring. Now, the recommendations as a challenge, Fèvre is probably, William Fèvre is probably my recommendation if you're looking for Chablis. So apologies, I'm throwing Catherine and Gil under the bus. If we've got any of those of their wines, we can add a link to. So that would be my recommendation on the Chablis. The Mac Forbes Chardonnay is harder because it's particularly fresh and fruity. So let me think about that one for a minute. The Mahi, I'm going to be really mean and actually suggest that if you like that reductive style, the Mornington Peninsula, what is the wine I mean? Not Ocean 8, Kuyong. So some of their premium blends, Kuyong, who we don't have at the moment, but Kuyong is a fantastic producer making wines in a reductive style, but not too reductive, but really nicely, or Kumu River. So if we stayed in New Zealand, Kumu River would be the no-brainer because Michael Brakovich is the guy that's kind of spearheading or certainly the thought leader on that particular style. For Bogle, I would say Wente produce some quite good oaky styles. I'm trying to think what we've got on our website at the moment that's worthy of a Californian counterpart. But the other style, if you like a little bit of oak, I would say that my other absolute favorite, and I couldn't find a home for it in this tasting, is actually the Society's Limari Valley Chardonnay exhibition label. That is quite literally my favorite wine, probably not in the world, sounds like an exaggeration, but it's my go-to wine. It's the wine that I constantly have on my wine rack. When my parents were over for my wedding, I served it the night before the wedding, and my dad immediately asked for a case of 12 to take back with him to France. So considering he's such a snob about, well, he's not a snob, he drinks local wine now and he's so used to what he drinks, and that Limari Chardonnay knocked his socks off. So I'd probably go with that. And then I've just seen somebody pop Tasmanian Chardonnay in the chat. There are some Tasmanian Chardonnays produced in this kind of blind spot Yarra Valley style as well. So they're worth looking into because Tasmania is a very, very cool climate, although often they do tend to use a little bit more oak, although not a lot. I hope that answered the question. I kind of went a bit round the houses there. Yeah, there's plenty, but I would say the Lemelson Willamette Valley is great. Yeah, not California, I agree. It's worth saying. Oregon, Finger Lakes. We don't currently stock any Finger Lakes New York wine. New York Chardonnay is amazing. It's fresh, it's vibrant, it's ridiculous, but it's very expensive. So unfortunately, Sarah hasn't found a wine that's a decent enough price for us to stock. But if you're prepared to shop around, then Finger Lakes wines are amazing. So yeah, I hope that was enough examples for you. Yeah, Tall Puddle, great Tasmanian Chardonnay from Catherine, agreed. That is a slightly more expensive one. Yeah, hopefully that was enough. But yes, if anyone has any other Chardonnay related questions or any other questions just generally, please do email me. You've got my email. I love talking about Chardonnay. I love recommending Chardonnay. I love drinking Chardonnay. And if anyone wants to know what I'm having for dinner, I have decided to have cod. We're having black cod tacos, which have got quite a lot of like lemon and avocado in. So I have intentionally made that so that we've got the blind spot, which is going to go back in the fridge before we eat it because it's definitely a wine that needs some chilling. So I get to put this back in the fridge and then I'll be having it with my black cod tacos. So I hope you all had a lovely evening. Thank you for joining me. Thank you, Catherine and Gil behind the scenes as well. It's been an absolute pleasure, and hopefully we'll do a few more great variety series. Obviously, we've had Catherine on Malbec, you've had me on Chardonnay. The world is our oyster. So many grapes to go through. So we'll hope to see you at the next one. So cheers, everyone.